Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Welcome back to our series, Ask the Consistory, where we answer listener questions. Now today is not a question that was proposed to me, but it is continuing on from questions that I've dealt with before. Today I want to deal with the topic of cessationism and Article 27 of the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. So I've already done, I think, 3 videos on cessationism, and in those videos I've explained what is the Lutheran position on cessationism. See, most people get confused when they hear the topic cessationism, and they think that Lutherans just don't believe in miracles or prophecy or any of that stuff. However, there is a big difference between absolute cessationism, which some people promote these days, and classic cessationism, which was originally taught by John Calvin and the Calvinists, but was also picked up and embraced by the early Lutherans. I mean, the early Lutherans were essentially already cessationists. They just didn't have the term and that explanation of that doctrine until Calvin put that forth, and the Lutherans embraced that early version of cessationism. Now, in my first video on cessationism, which if you haven't watched, I would recommend you go and watch, I explain how the classic view of cessationism is the belief that we believe the offices of apostle and prophet have ceased, and so the apostolic and prophetic gifts have ceased. And so the difference between this and other supernatural things is that the apostolic and prophetic gifts were supernatural abilities granted to those specific officers to serve as signs, as proof that they were preaching the word of God and that they were coming with a direct prophecy from God. And so the miracles done by those prophets were done as signs connected with their teaching. Also, as you'll see in like the book of Corinthians, it says that the spirit of the prophets is, subject to the prophets. And as you can see in the book of Acts, people like Peter and Paul seem to have full control over these supernatural gifts. And so that is the prophetic and apostolic gifts. And as cessationists, we believe with the death of John the Apostle, the last apostle, the apostolic and prophetic offices have ceased, and with them the apostolic and prophetic gifts have ceased. Now, this doesn't mean that miracles and prophecies and stuff like that can't happen, because God can work when and where He pleases with whomever He pleases. These are just few and far between, but they do happen. And so in my second video on cessationism and miracles, I talk about this and how the Lutherans embraced this prophecy of Jan Hus. So Jan Hus was this proto-reformer, this reformer before Luther, who was killed about 100 years before Luther, and as he was being martyred, he prophesied that in 100 years' time there would come a man who the Catholics couldn't stop, who would bring about a reformation to change the church. And so 100 years later, Luther comes along, and the early Lutherans did believe Luther to be the fulfillment of Huss's prophecy. Thus, the Lutherans, who are cessationists, believe that God still spoke through this prediction of Jan Hus to prophesy the coming of Luther. And so what I wanted to talk about is that that's something outside the Book of Concord, but there is actually a very similar account in the Book of Concord. And so I wanted to bring this up for 2 reasons. 1, to explain what is the true Lutheran position of cessationism, and 2, there are some Lutherans out there, even some Lutherans in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, who teach that Lutherans aren't cessationists, but that instead we are actually continuationists, and that just is not the case. The early Lutherans were not continuationists. We do not believe in the continuation of the charismatic gifts. We are cessationists. We believe that the offices of prophet and apostle have ceased. A particular person I would like to call out is Pastor Will Whedon. On his The Word of the Lord Endures Forever podcast put out by the Missouri Synod, he says that Lutherans are not cessationists. despite the fact that the official kind of teaching, or at least the majority position of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in which he pastors, is cessationism. For example, Pastor Hans Feeney of Lutheran Satire fame talks about cessationism in one of his Lutheran videos, that Lutherans do believe in this ceasing of miracles. So pastors like Hans Feeney say that yes, the Lutheran Church, and particularly Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, teaches cessationism, whereas Pastor Will Whedon says no, it doesn't. And there are other pastors in Missouri Synod that say the same. And they will like to pick up verses in the Book of Concord and say, see, the Lutherans are talking about miracles and stuff like this, therefore Lutherans aren't cessationists. But that again is a misunderstanding of the actual doctrine of cessationism. We are not absolute cessationists, we are classic cessationists. We do not believe all miracles and prophecies can never happen. We believe that the special prophetic and apostolic offices have ceased, and with them have ceased the apostolic and prophetic gifts that were connected with those offices. Yes, miracles can still happen. Yes, prophecies can still happen. They do happen. We do not deny that it's cessationist. We just deny that the special offices of prophet and apostle have ceased, along with those special gifts that were connected with those offices. We do, as cessationists, at least classic cessationists, do believe that prophecies and miracles can still happen. We do not limit the work of God. And so when the Book of Concord talks about miracles or prophecies taking place, that is not a rejection of cessationism. That is actually proof that Lutherans are not absolute cessationists, that we do believe that prophecies can still happen. This is actually a further explanation of what cessationism is. So no, these passages in the Book of Concord do not reject the teaching of cessationism. It rejects the teaching of absolute cessationism, but Lutherans were never absolute cessationists anyway. We were always classic cessationists, sometimes called, soft cessationists. We're not hard cessationists or absolute cessationists. So the particular example I want to look at is the example of John Hilton, mentioned in the very beginning of the Article 27 of the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. Here, Melanchthon, while addressing the abuses of monastic vows, talks about the Franciscan monk John Hilton, who seems to have died sometime before this, but was alive sometime around Luther's time, when Luther was in Eisenach. So John Hilton was around he predates Luther and them. He died in captivity in the year 1500. And so John Hilton was somebody who was just before Luther and them. And what happens is that Melanchthon says here, and I'll just quote directly from the Apology itself. Melanchthon says that he, John Hilton, predicted many things, some of which have already come to pass and others of which still seem to lie ahead. So first up, Melanchthon says John Hilton predicted things, so prophesied about things that were going to happen, and they've come true. So Melanchthon is accepting them to be true prophecies. This is a real person who prophesied things that were going to happen. They have come true. They were real prophecies. But now Melanchthon also goes on to reference a particular prophecy or prediction of John Hilton. So John Hilton had kind of got in trouble with the monasteries for, kind of being a reformer a little bit, and they essentially condemned him. They locked him up in captivity, and he died in captivity either due to his age or to his filth or to illness, as Melanchthon says in the Apology. But while Hilton was imprisoned, he said to the Franciscans in regard to monastic orders, he says, "Another one will come in the year of our Lord 15:16, he will destroy you and you will be unable to resist him. And Melanchthon is citing this as a prophecy that John Hilton had, that Melanchthon believed was fulfilled in the coming of Martin Luther with the start of the Protestant Reformation. And Melanchthon goes on to say that this wasn't just something that Melanchthon's making up, but that you can actually read this in Hilton's commentary on the book of Daniel. So in the book of Daniel, John Hilton left a note saying that in the year 1516, someone was going to come that was going to try and combat and rebel against the monastic orders, and that the Catholics would not be able to stop him. And Melanchthon saying this is a true prophecy. Now some people may be wondering, hold on, Hilton got this wrong. He says 1516. Didn't the Reformation start in 1517? And to that I'd say yes and no. The Reformation started in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door Wittenberg. Luther started his own Reformation in 1516. There is an excellent article you can find online called The Frustrated Pastor, written by some Presbyterian pastor here in Australia, and he's writing about the lead-up of Luther to the Reformation, and he particularly focuses on the year 1516 when Luther went through all these personal struggles with the teachings of the Catholic Church, and that even though it was 1517 when Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, it was already in 1516 that Luther had this personal reformation or personal conversion to the truth, and that Luther already in 1516 started to speak out against the abuses in the Catholic Church. And so John Hilton is right. There was going to be somebody who came in the year 1516 and he preached against the monastic orders, and the Catholics were not able to stop him. And so John Hilton accurately predicted that. And Melanchthon believed that this was a true prophecy that came true. And that John Hilton not only predicted the coming of Luther, but he predicted apparently some other things that also came true. Melanchthon doesn't list them here, but apparently Hilton predicted a number of things that all came true. And so this goes to show that God can still work when and where he pleases. He can still do healings and miracles and prophecies when and where he wills. However, this doesn't mean that this rejects the teaching of cessationism. It just means God can still work when and where he pleases. The proper doctrine of cessationism is not an absolute cessationism. The proper doctrine of cessationism says that the offices of prophet and apostle have ceased, and with them have ceased the apostolic and prophetic gifts. There are no longer offices of prophets and apostles that have control over these supernatural gifts that are used as signs to prove their authoritative, inerrant, infallible preaching and teaching. The apostles had these gifts given to them by God so that everybody knew that the apostolic teaching was inerrant and infallible, so that when the apostles wrote down the Holy Scriptures, we could know for sure that they were inerrant and infallible because God was backing those up with supernatural signs. Those offices have ceased. That is what we teach when Lutherans say we are cessationists. But as is clearly seen in the Book of Concord, Lutherans are not absolute or hard cessationists. We do believe that these prophecies and stuff like that can still happen. So, yeah, that kind of wraps up our video on Cessationism and Apology 27. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.